Back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about a pretty intense topic.
Yeah.
It's the ongoing war in Gaza. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
specifically, we want to examine whether or not it
But
can be classified as a genocide.
Yeah.
Um, and for this one, we've got some
Mm-hmm.
pretty heavy-hitting sources.
Okay.
We've got reports from Human Rights Watch.
All right.
We've got the Costs of War Project.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the Associated Press. We've got
Yeah.
statements from the International Criminal Court.
Right.
And we've got a report from the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine.
Okay.
Um, and one of the things I think that's going to be really important
Yeah.
in this discussion is, how do we define genocide
Right.
legally? What are the criteria? Because it's not just about
Yeah.
like how much violence there is.
Right.
There are very specific things that need to be met.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes this so important, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because people throw this word around,
No.
oh, it's a genocide. Well, is it legally speaking?
Yeah, it's the exact.
So the legal definition actually comes from the 1948 Genocide Convention,
Okay.
and it requires two core elements. One, you have to have prohibited acts that were committed.
Okay.
And two, you have to have a specific intent to destroy
Okay.
in whole or in part
Yeah.
a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group.
Okay.
And, you know, these prohibited acts, right? They include things like killing members of the group,
Yeah.
causing serious bodily or mental harm.
Okay.
And this is the one that becomes really important as we examine Gaza
Mm.
deliberately inflicting conditions of life
Okay.
calculated to bring about their physical destruction.
Wow.
So you can see how that last part, that's
Yeah.
really going to be key as we go through this.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about how this term genocide
Right.
was actually coined
Right.
by Raphael Lemkin,
Mhm.
who was a Polish Jewish lawyer
Right.
who witnessed the horrors of the Armenian genocide.
Yes.
So, like, it was a very personal thing for him.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, what makes history stick, right, is when you have those stories. It's
Yeah.
not just some abstract concept.
Exactly.
This was a guy who saw it firsthand
Yeah.
and said, we need a word for this.
You get a word for this.
It's got to be codified. It can't just be
Wow.
like ethnic cleansing or something like. This is something different.
It's different.
This is an intent to wipe out a people.
Right. It's so, like, in the Human Rights Watch report,
Yeah.
they called it a threshold crossed,
Yeah.
which is such a, like, pointed title.
It is, yeah.
But they talked about the systematic oppression
Okay.
of Palestinians by Israeli authorities.
Right.
And they go through like all these different things. They talk about restrictions on movement,
Right.
land confiscations,
Right.
denial of building permits,
Wow.
residence, revocations.
Yeah.
They talk about the suppression of civil rights.
So basically a whole system
Yeah.
designed to kind of control and dominate.
Exactly.
And that's where they start to draw this parallel to apartheid. Right, because what they're arguing is by doing this,
Right.
you're fragmenting the Palestinian population.
Right.
You're dividing them up geographically. You're systematically
Yeah.
taking away their rights. And so in a way, it makes
Yeah.
it easier for Israel to maintain control,
Right.
but it also makes it harder for the international community
Mhm.
to really grasp what's happening because it's so piecemeal.
Exactly. It's like death by 1,000 cuts.
Yes, exactly.
And one of the things that they focus on in the report
Mm-hmm.
to really illustrate this is this Palestinian area called Kufra Aqab.
Okay.
And this is this area that's been cut off from its own city
Wow.
by Israel's separation barrier
Right.
and essentially abandoned
Oh, wow.
by Israeli authorities.
So they're just kind of left in limbo.
They're in this total limbo. And the
Yeah.
report talks about how like crime has just run rampant
Oh, wow.
because there's like no rule of law there.
Right, because nobody's really governing them.
Exactly. And so it's just this like really stark example of like what happens when you have this systematic segregation.
Yeah, and it's like a microcosm of the
Yeah.
bigger picture, right?
Exactly.
You see that happening in Gaza, too.
And speaking of Gaza, I mean,
Yeah.
the power dynamic there is
Mhm.
so clear.
Yeah.
Since 2007, Israel has imposed these really severe movement restrictions.
Right.
I mean, so essentially they've turned Gaza into an open-air prison.
It is, yeah, it's a giant open-air prison.
Could you imagine?
Yeah.
Most residents have never even been allowed to leave.
It's hard to even fathom
Yeah.
what that would be like to be trapped
Right.
in an area that small.
Yeah, and so that's where we start to get into that third element of genocide, that
Yeah.
deliberately inflicting conditions of life
Yeah.
that are designed to bring about destruction.
exactly. And the Human Rights Watch report really
Yeah.
makes the case that this closure,
Yeah.
combined with these attacks on infrastructure, that really fits that definition.
And in the report, they tell this story of
Okay.
this young man named Yazan.
Okay.
And Yazan was offered a scholarship to study abroad.
Oh, wow.
So like a chance to get out of Gaza.
Right.
He had his exit permit.
Okay.
Everything was set.
All right.
He gets to the checkpoint,
Mm-hmm.
and the Israeli soldiers are like,
Yeah.
hey, if you give us some information
Oh, wow.
about your community,
Mm-hmm.
we'll let you go.
Wow.
And he refused,
Right.
and they denied him exit.
Oh, my gosh. That is awful.
I know. And so, his dreams are crushed.
Yeah.
He's trapped in Gaza.
Wow.
And it's one story,
Right.
but it really like
It
highlights
just shows you the reality of
Yeah.
what people are facing.
the human cost of this.
Exactly.
And it's not just the human cost that's staggering. The costs of War Project
Yeah.
has been tracking the financial burden of this conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and the numbers are mind-boggling.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
So what are we talking about here? What kind of numbers?
Well, they point out that the U.S. has provided at least $17.9 billion in security assistance to Israel since the war began.
Okay, so that's equipment training,
Equipment training, favorable financing,
right?
and really unwavering political support.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? It's
no.
not just the money.
Right,
It's the fact that the U.S. is so strongly
right.
backing Israel diplomatically.
Yeah, it really shapes the power dynamic.
It does. It really tips the scales.
Yeah, and just this past August,
Yeah.
the Biden administration announced a $20.3 billion
Wow.
arms deal with Israel.
Okay.
And this deal includes like advanced weaponry,
Like what kind of stuff?
F-15 fighter jets.
Oh, wow.
And it sparked a lot of debate in Congress.
Yeah, I bet.
Because some lawmakers are saying, look,
Yeah.
this is just going to escalate the conflict.
Yeah.
This is going to further entrench this power imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
And it really raises these questions about international responsibility.
Yeah.
And like, are there other ways
Right. Are there other approaches?
to approach this?
Are we just funneling money and weapons into a conflict without
Well,
actually trying to solve it?
Yeah. And meanwhile, the human toll is devastating.
Right. And what are we seeing there? Like what are...
I mean, reports from the UN and the Associated Press,
Okay.
they've revealed that over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed,
Mm-hmm.
including 13,000 children,
Oh my gosh.
countless others injured.
Yeah.
Beyond just the casualties, we see the systematic destruction
Right.
of vital infrastructure, hospitals, schools,
Mm-hmm.
power grids,
Right. The foundations of a society.
water systems.
Yeah.
The very foundations of a functioning society
Yeah.
have been targeted.
And that's what the UN Special Rapporteur's report
Right.
really focuses on, is this idea
Yeah.
that it's not just about killing people.
Right.
It's about destroying their ability to function
To exist.
as a society. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And one of the things that's really concerning
Yeah.
is that the UN report found that 42%
Wow.
of Palestinian deaths
Mm-hmm.
occurred in areas
Right.
that were designated as safe zones.
What?
Yeah. So it's like
Oh my gosh.
they're using this language of protection
Right.
to create this false sense of security
Yeah.
while they're still targeting civilians.
So they're basically manipulating
Yeah.
the language of humanitarian aid
Exactly.
to actually continue the violence.
Yes, and it's a reminder that we have to be really critical
Yeah.
in how we look at this.
Yeah. We can't just take things at face value. We have to really dig deeper.
And speaking of looking deeper,
Yeah.
the International Criminal Court
Okay.
has been building a case
Okay.
against Hamas leaders.
Right.
They've cited specific evidence
Mm-hmm.
of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Okay.
They've even applied for arrest warrants.
Wow.
Yeah, so like this is
You're not messing around.
they're not messing around.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that
Right.
the ICC is focusing on like
Yes.
specific acts of violence
Mm-hmm.
by Hamas.
Okay.
They're not looking at the broader question of genocide.
Right. They're looking at individual criminal responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay.
But their investigation does give us some insight,
Into the patterns of violence.
yeah, into these patterns of violence.
Yeah.
And the intent behind certain actions.
Right. Because one of the things with genocide is you have to prove intent.
Right.
It's not enough to just say, oh, a lot of people died.
Right.
You have to show that there was a plan.
Right.
Or at least a motivation.
The deliberate attempt.
Exactly.
And some of the things that we've heard
Mm.
from Israeli officials are really disturbing.
Like what kind of things?
Well, we've heard Palestinians being called monsters.
Oh, wow.
We've heard them being compared to the biblical Amalek,
Okay.
who were commanded to be utterly destroyed.
Oh.
Wow. We've heard pronouncements about the need to break their backbone.
Right.
And it's this dehumanizing language
Yeah.
that can be a real red flag.
It is, because when you start dehumanizing a group of people,
Right.
it becomes easier to justify violence against them.
It's like you're othering them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're saying they're not really human.
They're not us.
Right. And if they're not human,
Yeah.
then it's okay to treat them inhumanely.
And it's not just the rhetoric.
Right.
There have been leaked messages
Oh, wow.
from IDF social media groups
Okay.
that reveal a culture of celebrating violence
Oh, gosh.
and boasting about killing civilians.
Oh, wow.
And so it's just...
So this is like soldiers talking amongst themselves and basically bragging about committing atrocities?
So we've got this evidence, we've got these statements.
Yeah.
So the big question is,
Okay.
can the war in Gaza be classified as a genocide?
Right. And this is where,
The legal arguments get really complex.
Right.
I mean, there are differing interpretations of the law.
Right.
But what's undeniable
Yeah.
is the severity of the situation,
The scale of the suffering.
the scale of the suffering.
And the need to prevent further atrocities.
Yeah.
And the UN Special Rapporteur's report really takes a firm stance.
Okay.
They conclude that the ongoing Nakba, which is the Palestinian word for catastrophe, fits the definition of genocide.
Wow.
And that's...
So they're saying, this is it.
This is genocide.
This meets the criteria.
And we have to remember that the Nakba refers not just to this current war, but to the entire history.
To the whole history of displacement.
Of Palestinian dispossession and displacement.
And that's what makes it so powerful.
Right.
Because it's not just about what's happening now.
Right.
It's about a continuous process.
A process that's been going on for decades.
And that's what makes it so disturbing.
Yeah. It is. It's a very sobering thought.
Yeah.
And it really makes you question
Yeah.
what our role is in all of this.
Exactly. And I think that's something that we're going to have to
Yeah.
continue to explore as we go further into this deep dive.
Yeah. I'm really interested to see where this goes because this is heavy stuff.
Yeah, it is.
And, you know, that historical context really matters when we think about the potential for future atrocities because, like, those policies that we talked about, they're still in place.
Yeah.
They're still having a devastating impact.
Absolutely. This isn't just a history lesson.
Right.
This is about understanding how the past shapes the present.
Yeah.
And how what we do today can either perpetuate those injustices or contribute to a more just and peaceful future.
And the Human Rights Watch report actually gives some pretty specific recommendations about what needs to change.
Yeah, what do they say?
Well, they basically call on the international community and specifically countries like the U.S. That provide so much support to Israel to really reevaluate their approach. They're saying that, you know, decades of supporting this peace process while kind of turning a blind eye to these systematic human rights abuses has just made the situation worse.
It's just allowed it to fester.
Exactly.
And one of the things they recommend that I thought was really interesting is targeted sanctions against Israeli officials and entities that are implicated in these crimes.
So basically holding individuals accountable, not just the state of Israel.
Right. But the people who are making these decisions.
Exactly. And they also talk about conditioning arms sales and security assistance on concrete steps.
They actually change things.
To actually end the oppression of Palestinians.
I mean, that's a bold stance.
It is, yeah, for an organization like Human Rights Watch to take.
And it shows you how serious they are.
It does, and I think it reflects a growing sense of urgency and moral outrage.
Yeah, like enough is enough.
Enough is enough, exactly.
Like we need to see some action.
Yeah, empty words and half measures aren't cutting it anymore. We need meaningful action.
To hold perpetrators accountable.
Absolutely.
And that call for accountability is echoed by the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, who lays out this legal basis for seeking those arrest warrants against Hamas leaders.
Yeah, against individuals like Yahi Sinwar, Mohammed Dalif, Ismail Haniyeh.
Right. And so it's not just about condemning Hamas as an organization.
Right.
It's about saying...
It's about individual criminal responsibility.
These specific people
Yeah.
bear responsibility.
And Khan really focuses on those horrific attacks on October 7th last year.
The ones that triggered this whole war.
Exactly. He calls them barbaric and despicable.
Wow.
And he argues that they were clearly targeted at civilians and intended to inflict maximum suffering.
Yeah. And they've gathered evidence.
They have, from victims, survivors, eyewitnesses.
Former hostages?
Yeah. Former hostages. I mean, they've
done their homework.
They've done their homework.
And it's not just about punishment. It's about deterring.
It is about deterrence.
Yeah. Future acts of violence.
Exactly. Because if people know that they will be held accountable, they might think twice.
They might think twice.
Before committing these kinds of atrocities.
Yeah. And while the ICC is doing its thing, the UN is on the ground trying to deal with this humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
And it is a crisis.
It is a crisis.
I mean, the scale of the devastation is just immense.
Yeah. And
they're saying we need international aid.
Yeah, we need help.
We need help desperately.
And one of the things that's so concerning is that they've targeted essential infrastructure.
Right. Power plants, water treatment facilities.
Hospitals,
schools, like the very
things that people need to survive.
Have been deliberately destroyed.
And UNRWA, which is the agency that's specifically tasked with supporting Palestinian refugees. They're struggling.
They're struggling to provide
the basics.
The basics, food, water, medical care.
To a population that's been
utterly traumatized. It's displaced.
And we can't forget about the psychological impact.
We can't. The psychological impact is huge. Yeah. I mean, the trauma that's been inflicted on these people.
Especially the children.
Who've witnessed unimaginable horrors.
And the UN Special Rapporteur's report
talks about the generational impact. Yeah, the generational impact of this trauma. Yeah. And they argue that Israel's actions go beyond just physical harm.
Right. It's about breaking their spirit.
It's about
undermining their ability to build a future.
To even imagine a future.
Exactly.
And that sense of despair and frustration is reflected in the protests that have erupted across Israel.
Right.
The Associated Press has been covering these.
Yeah.
And people are calling for a ceasefire. They're calling for the return of the hostages that are still being held by Hamas.
And it just shows you how complex the situation is within Israel.
Exactly.
Right. You have the government that's maintaining this hardline stance. But you also have a growing segment of the population
that wants something different.
Wants
peace.
Exactly.
One image that really stuck with me
from the protests was there was this demonstrator who was standing in a cage that was suspended from a pedestrian bridge. And he was surrounded by all these people waving Israeli flags.
Wow.
And it was just this really powerful image of feeling trapped.
Right, and that's the thing. Yeah. Both sides feel trapped.
Yeah, the hostages in Gaza.
Yeah.
And the Israelis who want this to end.
Exactly.
And, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this war.
It's hard to believe it's been a year.
I know.
Yeah.
And so the question of how to move forward.
Right, how do we break this cycle?
How do we break this cycle of violence?
It's the million-dollar question.
It really is. The UN has proposed this phased ceasefire plan.
Okay.
But both sides have resisted it.
Right, because they both want concessions that the other side isn't willing to give.
And there's just this deep mistrust.
There is a deep mistrust.
That's built up decades of conflict.
Broken promises.
Yeah.
It makes it so hard.
It makes it so hard to find common ground.
Yeah. But we know from history that even the most intractable conflicts can be resolved.
They can.
Through dialogue and compromise.
But
it takes courage.
It does.
It takes empathy.
And it takes a willingness to see the humanity in the other.
Even those.
Yeah, even those we consider our enemies.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part.
So hard.
Because when you've been through so much pain, when you've experienced so much loss, it's hard to see the other side.
As human.
As people who are also suffering.
Right.
Who are also hurting.
And speaking of things that are hard, the Human Rights Watch report also looks at this issue of security.
Right.
which is often used to justify Israel's actions.
To justify the occupation, the blockade.
The whole thing, yeah.
And they say, look, Israel has legitimate security concerns.
Okay.
Those concerns can't justify systematic human rights abuses and the creation of an apartheid system.
Because ultimately, true security comes from justice.
It comes from peace.
It comes from peace.
Yeah.
It comes from addressing the root causes of the conflict.
Not just from military might.
Exactly.
And they even make this comparison to the U.S.'s own history of racial segregation.
Yeah, right.
They say that just as dismantling Jim Crow was essential for achieving true equality and security in America, dismantling the apartheid system in Israel and the occupied territories is essential for achieving lasting peace.
Wow. That's a powerful analogy.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's a reminder that...
It's a reminder that these issues are not unique to one place or time.
Right. The struggle for justice.
The struggle for justice?
And equality.
And equality transcends borders.
It transcends borders. It transcends history.
It does.
And as we confront these uncomfortable truths, and we grapple with the complexities of
it's important to remember that we're not just passive observers.
Right.
We have a responsibility.
Yeah, we have a responsibility to speak out.
To speak out against injustice.
To demand accountability.
To demand accountability.
And to support efforts to build a more just and peaceful world.
And that starts with education.
It does. It starts with education.
We need to educate ourselves.
About the history.
About the history.
The root causes.
The root causes.
Perspectives of all sides.
All sides.
Yeah.
Because we can't just listen.
Right.
To one narrative.
Right. We have to understand the nuances.
We have to understand the nuances.
The complexities. And we have to engage in dialogue that recognizes the shared humanity.
Just shared humanity.
Of everyone involved.
Of everybody.
Even those who are caught in the crossfire.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, we're all human.
We're all human, and peace isn't just the absence of war. It's about creating a society.
It's about creating a society.
Of everybody.
Where everybody
has equal rights.
It's equal opportunity.
Equal opportunities.
And equal dignity.
And equal dignity.
That's what we should be striving for.
That's a vision worth fighting for.
It's a vision worth fighting for.
And part of that fight is being honest.
About the power dynamics.
About the power dynamics.
Yeah.
We can't ignore the fact that Israel is a powerful state, heavily armed.
Backed by powerful allies.
Backed by powerful allies.
Yeah.
And the Palestinians have been systematically disempowered.
Disempowered and marginalized.
Marginalized.
Yeah.
So any solution has to address that imbalance.
Right. It has to level the playing field.
It has to level the playing field.
Yeah.
And it has to guarantee the rights and security of both peoples.
Of both peoples.
Not just one.
Not just one.
And that's where the international community
comes in. Because, you know, countries like the U.S. have a huge impact.
They have a huge impact.
On this conflict.
They do.
They have the leverage.
They have the leverage.
To push for change.
To push for change.
To hold Israel accountable.
To hold Israel accountable.
And to support. Palestinian self-determination.
Palestinian self-determination.
But it requires political will.
He does.
And so far.
That
will has been largely absent.
It has. And, you know, the U.S. has consistently shielded Israel.
From international pressure. Yeah.
They've vetoed UN resolutions. Wow. They've blocked efforts to impose sanctions.
And that raises some uncomfortable questions.
It does.
About complicity.
Yeah. About the failure to uphold the responsibility to prevent and punish
crimes against humanity.
And that brings us back to this question of genocide. I mean, is the international community, through its inaction, complicit in the suffering of the Palestinian people? Are we as global citizens failing to uphold our responsibility to prevent and punish this potential crime against humanity?
These are tough questions, but we can't shy away from them. You know, we've seen the world stand by and watch as genocide unfolded in Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur. Is Gaza just another tragic example of this failure to act? And if so, what are we willing to do differently this time?
It's a heavy burden to carry, and it's a responsibility that falls on each of us. You know, we can't turn away from the suffering. We can't pretend it's not happening. We have to educate ourselves, raise our voices, and demand action from our leaders. And it's not just about governments and international organizations. It's about individual responsibility, too. Each of us has a role to play in promoting peace and justice. You know, we can support humanitarian organizations working in Gaza. We can engage in constructive dialogue about the conflict and challenge those who perpetuate hatred and intolerance.
It's about recognizing that this isn't just a conflict happening over there. This is a conflict with global implications.
Yeah.
It reflects these deeply ingrained patterns of power, oppression, and dehumanization that we see playing out in different forms all around the world.
And at the end of the day, it's a conflict that reflects our own humanity or our lack thereof. The choices we make, the actions we take will determine whether we perpetuate the cycle of violence or contribute to a world where peace, justice, and human dignity prevail.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deeply challenging deep dive. The situation in Gaza is complex and emotionally charged, but it demands our attention and our action. We've only scratched the surface today, but I hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to learn more, engage more deeply, and consider your own role in building a more just and peaceful world.
Genocide is not just a historical event. It's a process that demands constant vigilance and unwavering accountability. And as we've seen today, the seeds of genocide often find fertile ground in discrimination, dehumanization, and indifference. As we move forward, let's all consider this crucial question. What responsibility do we bear as individuals to prevent atrocities? It's a question that deserves our deepest reflection and our most determined action.